Welcome, Jason. I'm so happy to have you here on the Embodied Astrology podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be with you too.
So, for listeners, Jason Holley is joining me today, and we are going to explore some of 2025's major astrological patterns within the retrograde patterns. And in 2025, all of the inner planet retrogrades and two of the outer planet retrogrades are shifting between the water and fire elements. And for me, when I was looking ahead at 2025, this was actually one of the most notable signatures of the year. And I am really excited to talk to you, Jason, about it. But first, I just want to expand my welcome and really offer you some gratitude. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Um, it was a real exciting moment when I discovered your work in 2022, or actually in 2021, I think is when I first encountered you through the virtual NORWAC conference, and then I got to meet you in 2022. Um, and I knew that there were other people out there doing experiential and embodied forms of astrology, and also just felt so inspired and motivated by the depth that you bring in with your practice. And I was wondering, before we get into, talking about this year's aspects and our kind of interpretations or felt senses of what this year's astrology is, would you share a little bit with me and with our listeners about your journey with astrology? Um, I've read some interviews and listened to some other podcasts where you give a kind of broader overview of your journey. But I have a specific question about,
Mm.
and this is because I know you've been a lifelong student of astrology, actually, and you're a multi-generational astrologer as well. And so I'm curious, when or how did you realize that what you were doing or engaging with was embodied and experiential? And how, in your practice, have you experienced the difference maybe between embodied experiential astrology and a lot of what I think astrology comes across as to many people, which is very theoretical, mathy, kind of more mental in some ways?
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Now, you're reminding me we have that in common, coming from astrologically alive lineages in with our mothers, right? I think in both
Yes.
cases. Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in the hills of West Virginia and five generations of diviners and astrologers, all through a matriarch. They wouldn't have called themselves a matriarchy, but they were a functional matriarchy, like the husbands attached into the line as they and we were all in one house, for the first couple of years of
Oh,
my
wow.
life, five generations. My great great grandma Cumby, she was a tea leaf reader, and renowned in a sense. Like people would come from all over for her to look at their cups, and astrology was in the air all the time, and in the body. I think I appreciate that question because. I think in many ways, right, my family, my grandmother, my mother's mother, she could erect a chart. Everyone else definitely knew their charts and knew mine. Mine was done when I was born. But really they were mostly working in what I might just call an archetypal mode, like a felt sense. It's the same kind of place where you feel something in your body and weather's coming, and that's real, right? That's not just an imagination thing. Um, or well, just imagination is not, I don't like that phrase. It is imaginal, but it is also attuned to natural reality. So I think so my astrology developed in that world, and I was probably the one who wanted to learn every last thing about it. Every little detail, every little calculation, and all of that. Um, but what I've always felt like, so then things went along, and I didn't really meet a lot of other astrologers at all until probably like 2008, just before Pluto and Capricorn, 2007 maybe. I mean, I was doing charts for people all the way through, um, and all kinds of different stuff, and teaching classes. But I started to meet other astrologers, yeah, about 20 years ago, I guess. And then you know, learned the tech more of the technical and more of the things that we track. Um, but I've always felt like I'm a little refractory to all the technique, like because I know you can do this with this instrument, that this is the true instrument of astrology to me is our embodied consciousness. So like that's the instrument I'm the most interested in helping people develop. Like, of course, we use the technique to kind of orient. That's how I always think about the math, is it's an orienting thing. But technique to me is the beginning of astrology. It isn't the end. Technique allows you to kind of locate yourself, right, in place and time. But then everything else about meaning and revelation and divination and creating relationship and participating, that all is way beyond where technique can't take you there. Imagination takes you there, somatic awareness takes you there, storytelling and relationship with others and with all of our relations take us to meaning. So I feel like the technique is just to kind of help people get on the earth and under the sky. And so I am left a bit cold by a lot of astrology because it's just talking, it's just mental concepts about things. And so I like the way you said it. When did you sort of realize what you're up to was embodied? Because that's exactly what it was. It was like, I don't, I feel like at astrology conferences, I often feel like an odd animal, because I need to move when I'm talking. I can't just like, I don't want to be up here telling people la la la, like with that kind of pseudo omniscience that I don't think it's a personal thing. I mean, there are, of course, narcissistic people in astrology, but I don't think it's really about their personalities. I think it's the cultural norm is that we have an omniscient lecturer and a group of people who, a producer of knowledge and a consumer of knowledge.
Mhm.
And that's not how we did it back in the hills, right? Like, I mean, it was actually quite relation. I mean, I'm romanticizing it a little, but it was an active relatedness and a participation. So I think then when I was studying here, I moved here to Santa Fe. Another thing we have in common, and I did a graduate program to become a therapist, and so it was a highly experiential orientation. I particularly like psychodrama was a big part for me, and also different practices that we could probably call eco psychology, and that's just naturally how I wanted to share astrology. It was almost like astrology is not like this thing; it's more like a companion with all these other things. Like I find my sense of what astrology is wants to be in our world is like a companion to many modes of living together and learning how to relate together to the whole gang, not just the human gang. Um, so that's like so then that became how I started to share astrology. I started to come up with different ways to, like astrodrama, what would be called astrodrama, which which was actually going on a lot in the astrology world. If we rewind like a couple of decades before that,
Mhm.
I wasn't there for that, but there was I think a lot more of that. And then the a lot of excitement came with all the technical materials that were being translated, and I think that in many ways has, changed the engagement. So that an answer? Yeah, I think that's how
Yeah.
it came to be.
Mhm.
And then you realize like, oh wow, there are many people doing this, but not necessarily um, talking about doing it, right? There are a lot of astrologers people would know, like Melanie Reinhardt or Brian Clark, who they know because they wrote the books about the thing. But if you talk to them and connect, you realize, oh, like Melanie Reinhardt is a very experiential mode. Like she and I have connected just in the last few years, and just as one example. And so there's a lot of it going on, and I think it's the mycelial, like embodied astrology feels like a mycelial creation that you
Yes.
all have made that starts to get us becoming self-aware of our connection.
Yes.
Anyhow.
Yes. Yeah, I love how you talked about astrology as a companion. And I was having a kind of felt sense memory imagination of, very early human beings. I don't know where we came from, but just the lived, felt sense experience of being part of Earth, and then being really affected by the sun and the moon and the elements, and needing to develop some kind of practices and languages to relate more effectively with those affects.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and then over time, that then becoming some kind of lexicon and more theoretical practice. But I really feel like there's no way that astrology is not an embodied practice because it
Yes.
deals so directly with the experience of being alive.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and and I'm glad you brought up Melanie because
Mhm.
similar to you, I was raised in an astrological
Right.
family. And then I didn't really start studying astrology on my own terms until my late teens, early 20s. And Liz Green's book on relating was the first book I ever read, but then I quickly found Melanie's work. And I just feel or felt so connected with how she was describing astrology. And I'm not surprised to hear,
Right.
that there's a connection for you too, and that she is definitely one of the kind of contemporary foremothers of experiential astrology.
Mhm. Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm curious about these waves of theory and philosophy versus waves of embodied experiential practice because it does really feel like um, what you were naming maybe with Project Hindsight and kind of like the early 2000s discovery and then interpretation or translation of these texts. And I'm thinking also about that um, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, and Capricorn generation
Right.
of right, the late 80s, early 90s being um, really at the forefront of some of this kind of Hellenistic revival.
Mhm.
And that has now also laid a ground of different kinds of information that
Mhm.
those of us who are more experiential or embodied get to play with, like you're saying, the
Exactly. Exactly.
technique sets the
Right.
field. And it does feel to me that there's another wave of enthusiasm around experiential embodied practice. And a lot of my peers I know are really excited about that, you included. And you have initiated now this conference, the Living Astrologies Conference, which is going to happen in October of 2025. I'm going to be presenting there. There's, I think, 20
Yeah, we have
astrologers.
20 facilitators. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and the program is really exciting for me. I mean, I feel like a kid in a candy shop when I read through the website. I want to do it all. Um, but yeah, do you have any thoughts on this kind of wave of current enthusiasm around embodied astrology or experiential astrology and kind of what you're hoping to bring forth with this conference?
Yeah, I really do. I feel it's just so nice to even just to sit with you and feel our kind of shared uh not everybody listening would see what I'm doing, but I'm like, moving my little hands around. Like what I mean is almost like little cells in the body that start to sing like that. Because when you name the wave, a wave moves through me, right? Like just a
Mm,
really, it's gentle, but it's strong. And
mm,
but what I lately, because you mentioned the Hellenistic revival, so-called Hellenistic revival, um, and and also you mentioned like a more, if we really imagine backwards in time, well before the codifications of astrology, right? Like most of what we're working with in the written astrological tradition is if we, it really largely goes to Mesopotamia, and then with Egypt and Greece and Rome and so on. Um, but it was all, I think it got disembodied in part because it was all techniques to keep the king in power. Like that was the
mm,
entire purpose in many ways, like truly was about how do we keep power relations where we want them. And
mm,
as we know, embodied approaches to astrology are quite threatening to power relation. Anytime you go to the implicit, anytime you go to sensation, imagination, dream, image, emotion, you relax control to some extent because something is going to emerge that isn't already part of how it's put together. And so the multi-polyvocal quality. It's inherently, to me, it's inherently polyvocal when we source from an embodied and relational mode. It invites multiplicity of voices, and we don't really have that in the written tradition. It's a very particular set of voices that wrote all that down, particularly the Hellenistic. That's a very specific
Hmm.
set of people who were philosophy adjacent, power adjacent, and maybe had their own modes of resistance. They had stuff going on. But if we get inside that box with them, that would be tragic, And I've been really, because I really am excited about what they've shown us. They've also helped us understand, like the houses, particularly. I think really understanding that the houses are set through diurnal motion, and quite a few things that are like contextualizing of the tradition. But like you, I like the candy store analogy for the conference, but even with this material, it's the candy store, like in the sense of like I want to get in there and play and psychologically imagine it and dream with it and give these techniques restore their I always see stories and not always, but often see like stories and even astrology as like little kind of like snakes with feet. They're lizards, but that's not quite the word. I just mean they're little creatures, that they're kind of flexible and want to play and they don't really, I don't think, want to be locked up. So anyway, that to say, like what I am experiencing about our mode of astrology, and historically, like in the Renaissance, astrology emerged again, right? It had been kind of more underground. Speaking in the West, that's not a universal cultural story, but in terms of the Western astrology, it definitely went underground for a while, and then it emerged in the Renaissance, which is an epistemic moment. I mean, it was a massive change at the Renaissance, and it's so interesting because astrology, it seems like, often emerges when we are in need of ways of telling story and experiencing that can bridge us from one episteme to another, from one system of knowledge to another. And it's not that the Renaissance birthed this great thing. It created its own notions of who is human and who isn't, and all these things. But we're at another epistemic moment, I think, I hope, where, much is really being challenged about how things are put together. And so here comes this huge interest in astrology while everything's in such a flux and getting more fluxy, and everyone's having to recognize discomfort. Astrology, of course, it can be a way to feel secure and be certain and know things. But much more creatively, it can be a way of, imagining into what other worlds are possible, and how might we relate, and how might we be developing new modes of consciousness with, the creatures around us. So I think of it as this embodied wave as like a real potential, again, epistemic bridge or something, that really
Mm.
sort of moves from this maximum separation, all about the human, and then all about a particular set of human, like the only human is a particular human, and then really moving out of that speciesism also, and I just think astrology, I mean, here's a circle of animals waiting to be remembered, that's part
Yes.
of, do you know what I mean? So I when I think about it in that historical way that you were describing the wave, I think yeah, it's really interesting, and it makes me think of, here we are meeting 3 days after Neptune went into Aries, right? Finished
Hmm.
higher around, um, and uh, and somehow I just felt the freshness of that, and you and me
Mm.
talking about a wave.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
had a couple thoughts when you were just talking. The first was just that for about a little over 20 years of my life now, I've been a student of energetic medicine and have studied Ayurveda and yoga, and over the last several years have really been um, a student of Taoism, and do not feel that I am in any kind of place to talk on that. But in the in the learning that's been happening for me, it's this coming back to a lot of the roots actually of astrology. And you mentioned Mesopotamia as being a place where astrology originated. But I also just want to give a bow and a nod to the Eastern traditions as well. And within, the Taoist cosmology, astrology is actually a really big part of those traditions. And like with a, with a martial practice or like a qigong practice, that so many of the movements, and it's the same with traditional yoga asana, so many of the movements are, they're direct inquiries into planetary energy, or they are exaltations of the, luminaries or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you said something, now I can't remember what you said, but it is leading me to the question I think will be a bridge probably to us talking about this year's astrology, which has to do with the theoretical philosophical capacities of astrology to predict and to look into the past and then into the future and to suggest correspondences between timelines. Um, and then the embodied and experiential capacity to channel
Mm-hmm.
and to really sense and intuit what vibrational frequencies want to be expressed and how they might express themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in today's conversation, we're talking about this retrograde pattern and this year and into next year's current astrology. Um, I'm a person who listens to a lot of podcasts. We were talking before we started recording. You said you don't. So I'll just tell you that a lot of astrologers out there love to predict shit,
Yeah.
and there's many, many podcasts where people are talking about their predictions of what's going to happen. And as an experiential kind of embodied astrologer, in my own sense of multiplicitous becoming and emergence, I feel like it's completely impossible to say what's happening because there are always multiple levels of what's happening and many cycles unwinding and unfolding and emerging with each other. And that I really do feel that we are part of creation and that we are part of whatever, astrological cycles or planetary cycles we're part of
Mhm.
becoming. So before we get into talking about this year's astrology and it's, how we feel about it, do you have anything to say about astrology as a tool for prediction or planning and mapping when it's coming from an embodied and experiential lens? And there might be a deeper question in this as well for you as a therapeutic practitioner who works with clients in their lives.
Yeah, the notion of prediction is limited for me because the mind that is doing the prediction can't conceptualize the thing that it isn't in yet.
Exactly.
It's not
Exactly.
in that. It's not in that yet. So all it can do is have fantasies about it, which is okay. But I don't think it doesn't interest me. It always and maybe that's part of why I don't listen to those podcasts. It just doesn't. I don't know. I guess I just don't feel like I need to know. I don't know that, so for me, there's just not juice in it. I mean, I'm a person who really follows where do I feel the juiciness of things.
Mm,
I don't feel juice in that. What I feel a lot of juice about, though, is participation and relationship. And so relating to these, for me, a lot of times these days, I find that the planets and the astrology feels very animal to me, and that's how it talks to me now. Sometimes also with mythology and story is kind of like when you speak of the vibratory frequency. I think my modes of perception work with story, but that's still the same. I feel that we're in conversation with the same things, and we just each have our perceptual modes. So like the thing that I like is just to talk to, or talk meaning not just language, but to feel them and really just to keep developing your capacity to hear or listen. Like, you know, I think that's like when I work with astrologers to help them with their practice, the main thing I feel like I'm helping is to be able to hear and listen and recognize and acknowledge and honor. Like so to hear Mercury and what Mercury might sound like or feel like, or what it might cause a tightness or a looseness. And so for me, it's way more about right now in this moment, like where is it and yes, you can then imagine where it could go and ways you could, but it becomes more collaboration. I just guess the predictive mindset for me often has the fantasy of the mind in a vacuum, the Archimedean point, the Greeks called it, that point where you can get out of everything and reflect on it. And I mean that's
How
there
do you
might
do
be
that from a human body?
right. I mean, maybe there are transient moments. I don't want to deny it as, I
Hmm.
don't, that's not how I experience reality. I feel sensuously embedded. So, and I like it basically. I mean, not all the time, but I think I think I feel most effective, safe, alive, when I feel fully like here and I'm not trying to climb out. But I think that prediction, so that would be what I would say is like, and it has the word, it's a speaking thing, an addiction,
Mm,
it's language mediated, and language is wonderful, but again, I would say when astrologers are doing prediction, what I would want them to do is use language as an invocation, right? Not as a description. Language always fails when it describes. Like it never can do that. It's not, I mean, description, it can't be done. But invocation is definitely a doable thing. And so to invoke the emergent archetype and through how we are in our bodies by moving like we think it would move or using the tone. I think that gives us information, but more about like emergent possibilities. I always have I like an emergent model of reality versus an unfolding. People use that unfold like as if it's all, but it's the three body problem in complexity science, right? Like as soon as you have more than two, anything could happen. And
yes.
what do we have? So many.
9 billion plus everybody who's not human.
Yeah, I mean the Pinion out here right now, right, has had a
Hmm.
really big influence on me in recent time. It's been suffering. We've been had very dry this time and this summer, and I'm just keenly aware. And I sit right here with that all day long, and
Mm,
uh, you know exactly. And they have their astrology, right? Like the trees and the animals, they all have their way of being in conscious participation with the night sky. Um,
mm,
so to me, they are also the animal. Like when we gather, I feel they are our ancestors of astrology too.
mm.
They do things differently under different skies, which is kind of what we do.
That's right. That's right. Wow. In just this last part of our conversation, I felt like I understood what we're talking about in our conversation today with the thematic of really looking at retrograde as a symbol and, inviting in this more inward, backward, non
Mm,
quote unquote normal way of experiencing something.
yeah.
And then really working with fire and air as, out of the four elements, the two that are probably more intuitive
Mm,
and sensing from an inner place.
mm.
And that not that air and earth aren't present in everything that we're going to be talking about, but that we're not really working with that sense of logic or materiality as much.
Right. Yeah. I like that you said that because I was thinking about that before we met too, is that about the way that fire and water are really intimately like they're so much of a subjective and often have a charge in them, like a kind of a, whereas air and earth can attempt a little more quote objectivity, not objectivity, but an attempt to be more neutral and yes, fire and air are so like sorry, fire and water. We both said it that way now.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Fire, that's intriguing. Uh,
Hmm.
fire and water are both very all in, like there's an all in quality to fire and to
Hmm.
water that is can be challenging and wonderful both, right? But yeah,
Mm.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I'm feeling it too. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, my immediate thought is, oh, fire and water where life starts, that's the breeding grounds, really. Um, so let's start there. Let's dive in. We're going to be talking today about the retrogrades in 2025, which are in this really interesting way overlapping with each other, most of them between the signs Pisces and Aries, and then we'll definitely also be looking at Mercury's other retrogrades, and then Mars retrograde between Leo and Cancer.
Mm,
Um, but before we get into the details of the astrology, let's begin with the symbols.
mm,
Jason, when you feel the symbol of a retrograde,
mm,
what do you feel? What emerges for you?
mm. Well, right when you said it, right, I feel how do you describe it? It's like my tummy, my belt, like there's again, it's hard to find the language for if people are just listening, but like um there's a kind of a turn inward, like there's an energetic turn inward, like what I would say is almost like an energy initially goes out a little and then it turns back on itself. And it really reminds me of how energy is, magnetism happens when you run something through something, like it's got that quality. But it also creates an accumulative energy. That's what I feel right now as I sort of hang out with it with you. Um, and 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 I find, because we begin with a station when that happens, we begin with the planet seemingly still, um, that for me, these retrograde energy is very internal, and I'm thinking of the inner retrogrades. I'm not sure about the outer, but the inner retrogrades, like Mercury and Venus right now, um, that there's a really nice invitation to go into deeper reflection, and open to more implicit material, material that is not yet symbolized, particularly with Mercury. Like I think that's a Mercury retrograde in particular, because Mercury being our one of our beautiful images of symbolic process. And the retrograde period for me is so much of an opportunity to kind of unzip the word, unzip the signifiers, and get into the pool of the signified, like detach that thing and what you think it means, and let like just an unzip. And because it's always unstable anyway, right? Language is always so unstable. Every word is, barely holding itself together. So, they only hold themselves together through their system of relations. Like they don't have their own existence. So, when you unzip it, I think it just opens up a lot of, it just opens a lot up, potentially, if that's where we turn toward, if we turn towards that, if we're trying to keep things going, I think then that's when it gets tricky. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, so for me, there's a turn and there's an unzip. There's like a quiet unzipping. Yeah.
mm, mm,
Right now, that's what I feel. Again, I just want to say, like, for me, images and symbols coming, they're promiscuous, so the symbol reveals itself in exactly the form that we can imagine, know, feel, you and I and the people listen, the field that is constellated for our moment here, and the pinion and my home and yours. It's like, this is the way it takes form for me right now. It's not that I go around saying, "Oh, retrogrades are turning in and as unzip," but I try to make myself really available to how does the symbol want to be known right here.
I like how you talked about the words falling apart. And in my body, how I felt that when I asked the question was deeper awareness of my back body.
Mm,
And this way that, I think a lot of folks who do physical practices, we have practices of sensing the back body or kind of trying to expand the energetic body into what is not visible. Like we can't see, for sighted people in the same way that in our culture, the forward motion is dominant because our eyes are in the front of the head.
yeah, yeah.
And and in what you were saying about the words falling apart, I could feel how part of what happens for me energetically when I attune with the back body is relationship. It's like a more encompassing, deeper, and yet also more subtle sense of relationality. I have a lot of kind of more associated symbolic feeling of what's behind me in terms of everything
Mm,
that has come before and is happening now that allows this coming into being.
mm,
And just like the words fall apart without everything that's attached to them, so do we,
yeah,
as
yeah.
our individual selves. And it feels like retrograde. periods are often periods where I notice that things fall apart from the way that they had felt solid to me during
Yes.
especially the initial direct foray, where there's that first directive of like, this is the thing, and there's a solidity to it, and then something has to fall apart. And in the falling apart, often the complications are relational.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because falling apart is a recognition of relationality, like that.
Yes.
Whatever the separateness story undoes, and so yeah, we are almost we become more consciously relational when we fall apart. That's almost always what will happen.
Yeah.
Um, I'm with you. I was just appreciating you naming the back body. And I was thinking about how I think over the years in my own living with astrology, retrograde periods feel very resourcing to me. And I felt myself, because I leaned back as you spoke, and I just sort of turned on, or not turned on, but became aware of the back. And and I think at one level, if we're trying to keep going front, then it's going to feel very hard, possibly in a retrograde. But I do think there's a possibility to really, yeah, lean into the what's behind, and because I find them very resource. I really do. I particularly the inner group, even including Mars, which I think people get a lot of energy about that one, but I find them very resourcing. Yeah.
I do too. Yeah, and I also agree that the more I have learned to work with the theory of astrology and
Mm,
really map it out for myself and prepare for retrograde times or contextualize for myself when it's happening, that they are deeply resourcing. And I'm so glad that you brought that particular RE prefix
yeah.
in because I feel like this is one of the places where I'm constantly trying to chip away at this at the monolithic kind of ideas that get passed through with astrology that retrogrades are somehow bad. And especially like you said with Mars, that and especially when Mars goes into Cancer, or into a place where it's
Mm,
afflicted or something like that. Um, and as a natal Mars in Cancer person, I've had all kinds of feelings about the way people have described it. But yeah, I really feel that there is this sense of with the release can
mhm,
be more resourcing. And I'm remembering a guest we had at Embodied Astrology for, we had a series hosted by Gabs 404 on Neptune, actually at the anaretic degree at 29 Pisces last year.
mm,
And they brought a guest in, Danny D'Amelia, who invited us to think about how do we refuse, with one word,
yeah.
refuse something in order to refuse.
Ooh,
And
wow. Okay, like that.
yeah, that kind of came up for me with that. So,
Yeah.
so this year, the retrogrades, I mean, not all of them. Uranus is moving from Earth into air and then back to Earth and then back to air. And Pluto's now solidly in air. But everybody else that we're working with, for the most part, in this, traditional or contemporary tradition of the solar system is in fire and water as they're retrograding. So we kind of started to touch on this, but let's go deeper. Fire and water
Mm,
as elements
mm,
and symbols.
mm.
Go.
Yeah. Well, that's a very fire request. Go.
Go, feel.
Yeah, fire, I mean, that whole spark of life, and for me, there's one of the things too that I feel about with fire is just the immediacy, the not mediated, like the here it is, this is it right here feeling. That is, I think, really also good medicine for how intensely mediated people's lives are now, literally by mediascapes and screens and well, those things basically. And the hunger for immediacy, I would think, is very likely, particularly like with Neptune's movement into Aries and like the air energy again. I don't think that the mind and the body are enemies inherently. However, they can be that can be what happens, right? Language can become the enemy of embodied experience. It doesn't have to be. But and that would be one of the things that can happen with air type of energy is sort of, a lot of mediation, a lot of conceptual stuff, a lot of like, not just like, okay, right now, right here, what do I feel? Or what's happening? So there's a happeningness that I feel with fire that is so just kind of has to be itself, has to be what it is. There's a self-existing quality, like that is for me, I keep, pushing my body keeps going forward talking about fire, right? I mean, it has that energy. And so it's quite meaningful for how the symbols begun to share itself with us because I there's the forward with fire, and then I do think, at least in this sky, there's a lean back that is possible with the with the retrogradation, like a kind of like, and I feel like it has to do a lot with like what's back in the water that you want to come with you. Like, what do we want? What's there that wants to, if I just stay with that motion that I'm in right now, where I'm kind of leaning forward and then going back and then coming back forward. Um, it feels really good to revisit the water for me in this moment. Like I'm just like, oh yeah, that does feel good. And again, resourcing. Into a very new world. There's a newness to fire. Uh,
Mm,
I think, and particularly Aries fire.
mm,
Yeah.
mm, Yeah, I love that. I found myself doing that as well when you were
Mm.
describing that, kind of rocking forward and rocking back, and again, feeling the back body and also feeling an undertow.
Yeah.
And
Oh, good word. Yeah.
yeah, and I had an image of
Mm.
I don't live far from the coast, so I there's this place where I go um a couple of times a year, and every time I go there, the coastline is different.
Mm.
And sometimes I'll stay for a couple of days, and you can watch the coastline changing
Mm.
with that kind of movement forward, toe back, movement forward, toe back, and
Mm.
um,
Mm.
yeah, I found my mind thinking about the tide pools and how in those shallow pools of water, life is growing, and it's growing really in this kind of confluence of what can happen with the sunlight.
Mhm.
And then, of course, with the day and night cycles, it's an important part of being
Mm.
able to work with fire is having a break from it as well. Um, but
Yes.
yeah, really feeling that sense of newness and creation, and that water and fire are such creative, I mean, like deeply primordial
Yeah.
creation essences.
Yeah,
Hmm.
totally. I feel that, and yeah, you've taken me to the Redwood National Park near the border of Washington and or sorry, California and Oregon. There, and just I remember being there. I guess it was around solstice a couple of years ago. It was winter solstice, and
Mm,
that experience where that everything's covered in water, and then when the tide is out, all these anemones and
yeah.
all these so bright color and very just remarkable creatures, and that I love that image of the water, the water cycle with the retrograde direct, like as we speak about it right now, I think. And what it says to me also is like a really consciousness opportunity because I feel like we don't often get to relate with those animals,
Mm,
anemones and starfish. I don't. I mean, and you kind of have to know when to go, right? There's a thoughtfulness to it, and you have to get into the rhythm of the tide. You're not going to have the encounter if you don't know the tides. If you don't know the rhythm, you won't know that that's happening. I didn't know.
yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
not spent much time in that part of the world, and so yeah, I feel that as we're describing it,
Mm,
you can really see
mm,
bright green anemones
mm,
and starfish and
mhm.
all those Pisces colors.
I felt like this chill when you were talking about you need to know where about the tides, and recently I was at this place on the coast at a full moon, and it's like big tides, huge king tides, um and it was quite dangerous to be on the beach, so we weren't going out. And then I was that kind of brought me to think about all of the elements have their danger, but the danger of fire and the danger of water are these deeply archetypal dangers that I feel humanity has really it's like some of our most basic struggles is how do we work with these kinds of encounters, enormous waves or monsoons or big storms and fire and um yeah, I wonder if that would be a good kind of transition to start to talk about the outer planets. I was thinking that we could go from the outer planets back to the inner planets, and maybe we'll start with Neptune and Saturn, and in terms of this kind of primordial creativity and immense danger that
Mm.
fire and water both can represent, and then Neptune and Saturn together. And feel free to, leave that or deviate from it. But yeah, where do you go with this kind of symbolic um, movement in tandem of Neptune and Saturn from the last degrees of the zodiac into the first degrees of the zodiac and then back again together?
Mm. Yeah, if it's okay, I want to stay with what you shared at first, the part about the danger and the terror, also sort of a primordial terror of water and fire that we carry for good reason as very vulnerable, fleshy creatures. And I was thinking of the word consume. People are afraid of being consumed by the water or consumed
Exactly.
by fire. Um, and and I think it's a really nice existential understanding of the elements for me, because I do think they are so charged and there's so much material. If you were thinking in terms of, sometimes we draw spectra of like, you know, um, of a kind of on one end a sort of a hyper arousal or a sympathetic activations, fight and flight and hyper, this type, and then at another end there's a kind of a checking out or disengaged, or that kind of, or even you could say anxious attachment and avoidant. There are a million uh, words in the very frankly deprived language of psychology, which only has 150 years of people playing with it. So we have a much better language, but because we do all use these language, people use all these words, trauma and everything else. So the fire element, yeah, it does have like activation. You get flooded, you're burning, those words give us some understanding of it. Yeah, this is the sort of material that threatens how we have it put together, and threatens the capacity to really hold. Again, all the words are problematic. Like contain is not a word I would want people to get too attached to, um, because I think it's probably got a lot more to do with flow with, participate with, find a way with, get even more related so that you can hold even more of these states. Like, because it's not really about, it would not really be respecting the element to say you're going to somehow stay with the way you are and do something with it. It's probably a lot more about how do you move into relationship with it. And there is the risk of consumed, right? There it really is. And so maybe that takes us to that Neptune Saturn dance, because they are, interesting images of, Neptune has so much imagery around surrender, around release, around letting go. And Saturn has a lot of image around, keep the ship afloat, stay the course, make life work, be functional. And Saturn really values, Saturn's traditionally a day planet. It values day consciousness things like, functionality, seeing things clearly, making things work. Um, And Neptune has for me, a very nocturnal quality of consciousness that's very multiplicitous and, undermines any fantasy of the separate self.
Mm,
Neptune seems to take apart,
mm,
whereas Saturn seems to say, hey, this improvised thing called the separate self does have its uses.
mm,
It
mm,
could be, so I'm sort of seeing them in that conversation as they move back and forth across the beginning and the end of the zodiac, right? They go back and forth, and you know, with a lot of different, emotion. Anyway, we can come to that, but that's my first sort of image.
mm.
How about from you? I'm curious where you go.
Well, one thing that was coming up for me was thinking about how both planetary symbols are so often associated with devouring, but in really different ways. And so how Saturn Kronos, devours the creative offspring
Yeah.
and kind of doesn't let certain things emerge in
Mhm.
that devouring, and how Neptune or Poseidon, devours with the ocean and kind of it brings about this really immense kind of total cleansing of
Mhm.
what has been the forms that have been erected in order for something else to come through.
Mhm.
Um, and so I guess there's something in that for me, that we are living at a time in one of the Earth's epochs that is a time of massive apocalypse. And apocalypses have happened and are happening, and there are multiple, and they converge.
Yeah.
And we're living in this time that some people call the Anthropocene, and um, really directly an epoch of catastrophe and falling apart that stems from this very kind of Chronos Saturnian, white supremacist, patriarchal, colonizing, whatever, instinct to devour the kind of creative, emergent biodiversity of life, and put it into boxes and make it make money, and all the, kind of industrial growth that has been the focus of the last, especially 500 years or so. And that now the ramifications of that mean uh, a process happening for Earth and with climate systems that feels very Neptunian, in this way where it's so unpredictable. It is very immense, and entire communities are getting wiped out, and coastlines are being flooded, and the landscapes that at least we're used to kind of
Mhm.
being more stable within our lifetimes are becoming very unstable, and we're being told that that instability is only going to increase.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those, when you're speaking there too from the stories and I mean, meaning, some of the mythology and the way they work with that. And I do think, where that takes me is just, one thing Saturn and Neptune also have in common also is the sensation of loss, and I think also grief. There's a melancholy, there's a tone that they have in common. Even though their operations and their motivations seem very different, but yet there's both of them. I think there is they kind of live with an understanding that they're not the deniers of the things you just said. To me, neither Saturn nor Neptune, I would say. I feel like there's a way that often we see with Saturn Neptune conjunctions the disillusionment, collective disillusionments. Like a melancholy mood, depression, those types of words. And I didn't mean that economically, but maybe.
Mhm.
But economics hasn't found its own mythic language. It's still, it hasn't figured that one out. But the tone, the feeling tone of Saturn Neptune, for me at least, it has a kind of um, yeah, melancholic, but again, that to me isn't a bad feeling at all. Like that's a really important feeling, a really rich. It has a lot of texture,
Yeah.
melancholy, and a lot of it generates a lot of empathy and a lot of relationality towards others and oneself. Like, what am I
Mm,
losing? What am I? And uh, it's quite generative of empathy.
mm,
That's what I think about when I think. I mean, obviously not always. I mean, people can get very isolated in that mode, um,
mm,
and self-centered in their, oh, my life, terrible, this and that. But I don't think that's inherent to the archetype. I think it's,
mm, mm,
melancholy. I guess as a therapist, I find a melancholy attitude. Um, I don't know. It's a nice person to have in the room. If you have a melancholic person, I mean, at one level, people could be like, "That's a drag," because we have such an overvaluation of other things. In at least in the United States, that's how I feel. No melancholy allowed is definitely one of the rules around here. Like just all the exclamation points people put on everything and all the smiling and all, there's still a lot of that, the hypermania of textual communication is kind of amazing. So kind of having a melancholic person around, who maybe is a quote drag in a way, like or grumpy cat, but actually like that person often the field is easier to be in when they are present.
mm,
Now,
mm,
that,
mm,
so I'm enjoying this
mm,
conversation to be it's feeling nice to me to think about Neptune and Saturn that way right now. I haven't again, this for me, we just do it in the moment. But
mm.
I'm really feeling like, oh yeah, that'll be a relief to spend some time with them and there's a wisdom in it. And it's not ungenerative at all. It's a rich texture melancholy. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of bringing me to some of the feelings that I have also in the space between Pisces and Aries.
mm,
Um, and I'm just thinking about great art, like really good music or an amazing film or poetry,
mm,
comes from a place where there's melancholy and there's a real, there's an encompassing of loss and pain
mm,
that
mm,
also then produces something.
mhm.
And I don't know if you're interested in the Sabian symbols or if you work with them much, but
Yeah, I like them. Yeah.
yeah, I really enjoy them a lot. And so this year, in 2024 and 2025, I think one of the most interesting things is how long Neptune hangs out at the last degree of the zodiac, at the anaretic degree of Pisces, and
Mm,
that um, in in this year's astrology in 2025, Neptune has made just a couple of days ago made its first ingress into Aries in like 150
yeah.
something years since it was
Right.
there. And then it'll station retrograde on July 5th at 2 degrees of Aries, and then it will return to the last degree of the zodiac, 29 Pisces,
Mm,
where it stations direct December 11th of 2025.
mm,
And last year in 2024, Neptune hung out for a while at the 29th degree, and it had a whole station
mm.
retrograde there. So it was in its um, what's it called? When it pauses and slows down, it
Station,
storms.
yeah. Mhm,
Um, so yeah, the Sabian symbol for the last degree of the zodiac is a great stone face, and a young person looking at this carving
mm,
and then and kind of like seeing this cultural ideal and then becoming that ideal.
mm,
And
mm,
then the first degree of the zodiac, the first degree of Aries, the symbol is a oh gosh, what is it? I pulled it up for a second. A woman um, just risen from the sea with a seal embracing her.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and yeah, I'm thinking about these kind of qualities of melancholy
mm,
um, that for me, when I tune in with them in my own body right now, I feel so much tension between the past and the future.
mm,
With melancholy, that there's a deep sentimentality and nostalgia in it, and a kind of sometimes remembering what was and no longer is, or a longing for something that has not yet arrived. And there, it feels like there's this suspension,
Mm,
in melancholy for me of
mm.
the present moment feeling so endless and vast, but also feeling liminal in certain ways, like
Yeah, very.
not with the thing that I'm longing for.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, I think that liminality and certainly, 29 Pisces type of energy, that in betweenness, that feels really, and one of the things I think about too with the Saturn Neptune part of this is that um, there's a slow quality, there's slowness, which is a bit paradoxical since things will go into Aries and you feel an acceleration. And I think a lot of people feel a lot of acceleration right now because eventually, right, what we're heading into is everything in fire and air, right? So that meaning, more or less by the end of the year and the following year, all the outers are going to be fire and air and uh, and that is very typically faster than earth and water, and so I do think there's a really nice time right now to uh, take time with the slowness and develop the capacity for slow, which again I think Saturn and Neptune might have that ability, like might actually help us. Um, because there is, or at least to have that place in one's own consciousness that can be in that amid massive
Hmm.
movement and change. And because, yeah, it's likely that the climate will be more unstable. It's likely that huge numbers of people will be in involuntary movement for various reasons, all of which are not choice. A lot of that, a lot of these big shifts and fast things. And so the Neptune Saturn for me partly is a place to tend and anchor in some way,
Hmm.
because it does feel like they really do give a way of perception that's really eh, rich, deep, and I love the Sabian there when you were sharing because I was really feeling the sometimes I feel like with Neptune at 29, uh, I feel like like a sponge that is just like a sponge in your house, saturated sponge that is just really needs to be wrung out. It's getting moldy or melt, because like
Definitely.
it's like poor thing, like and and so but again there's history in that water, there's memory in that water. There's just a lot to keep the channel open to um as things start to move faster. 'Cause I
Hmm.
think that's pretty I don't mean that in a predictive way, but I feel like I can feel it happening. It's more of a felt current.
Hmm.
Um, that there's like a um yeah, it's yeah, anyhow, I don't know if I'm not sure that's making sense actually, but it's for
It's
me that
making sense.
the slow is what I um am aware of feeling like, oh yeah, that would be helpful to have around. Kind of like we were saying astrology. Like at the beginning,
Yeah.
you and I were saying it's like a companion. Um,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
often,
when
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
mm, well, I mean, one thing that's kind of coming up for me hearing you say that is thinking about so you mentioned by the end of the year all the outers will be in fire and air. Interesting that both of us had those verbal mistakes at the beginning of our
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
podcast.
Right, we're getting
So
ahead of ourselves.
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
That's it. That's that phrase, right? Yeah.
So there's this really interesting configuration, right? It's incredibly strong this year between June and October, but it's actually fairly consistent within a 10-degree orb from now, from March of 2025 through June of 2026. And Saturn and Neptune at the first degrees of Aries will be sextiling Uranus in Gemini and Pluto
Um,
in Aquarius.
yeah.
And then Uranus and Pluto will be trine with each other. Um, so I don't know if you call that a minor trine or talent trine or something, but that configuration of two
Yeah, the
sextiles
little
and a
triangle.
trine.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
hmm And so Saturn today, we're recording on April 3rd, and Saturn is at 24 degrees of Pisces, and we're about 10 days away from the beginning of Saturn's retrograde shadow. So when it passes the degree point that it will retrograde back to, and similar to Neptune, Saturn will be entering Aries this year, May 26th. It stations retrograde at the first degree of Aries on July 13th, and then it will go back into Pisces early September. And it will return to basically where it is now. And it stations direct there in November of 2025, and it's back into Aries by February of 2026. But what is happening tomorrow, on Friday, April 4th, is that Saturn and Uranus are perfecting a sextile.
Mm,
Uranus in Taurus, Saturn in Pisces.
mm,
And so this talent trine is starting, it's really starting to get underway.
mhm,
Um, and when you were talking about what do we need to remember about moving slow,
mm.
one of the major themes for me of Uranus and Taurus and Neptune and Pisces, and especially these last few years with Saturn in Pisces as well, has been this work around rest as resistance,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And
Exactly.
and the capacity to slow down and
Yes.
pause and actually to be with.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking of Trisha Hersey, Rest is Resistance. I'm thinking of Bayo Kamalafe talking about the times are urgent, let's slow down. That
Mm,
we have to be with the trouble, Donna Haraway, like just trying to spin our wheels and get somewhere else really fast usually only leads us to recreate different versions of the same problems.
yeah.
Like you're talking about, being in the mind of of an embodied experience. We can't really get outside of that. But
Right.
what we can do when we slow down is connect and access our intuition. And especially if we're slowing down together, we can co-regulate and then have collective intuition or some other kind of creative emergence.
Mhm.
And that feels so important as we head into whatever is coming next.
Yeah, I feel that too.
Hmm.
All right. Yeah.
So I just am fascinated by the symbolism of this year's astrology because Saturn and Neptune are doing their thing that we've already described. We've also had eclipses kind of following this pathway. We had an eclipse on March 29th, and the eclipse North Node pathway has been moving from Aries back into Pisces.
Mm.
And then at the same time, Mercury and Venus are doing this. So we have interplanet retrogrades.
Yeah.
Mercury retrogrades all the time, 3 times a year. Venus only retrogrades about once every year and a half. But they don't always combine. They're not always happening at the same
Oh, no.
time.
No. Yeah, this is unusual, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so it's very remarkable that Mercury and Venus are both um, they're both doing this thing right now. So I'll just give the data and then I'll hand it over to Jason. But so Venus station retrograde on March 2nd at 10 degrees of Aries. It moved back into Pisces on March 28th. It will station direct on April 12th at 24 Pisces. And then it will move back into Aries April 17th.
Mm.
Um, actually, that's incorrect. I didn't write that date down, but whatever. That's Mercury. So Mercury also Mercury entered Aries March 4th, stationed retrograde March 15th, going back into Pisces March 31st. Mercury is about to station direct on April
Yeah.
7th at 26 Pisces, and then moves back into Aries April 17th. So both Venus and Mercury are stationing basically at the same place, like 9, 10 degrees of Aries, going back to basically the same place, 24, 25 Pisces.
Mm.
And then they're crossing the path of Saturn and Neptune and the eclipses.
Mm.
Do with that what you will. I don't know. Mercury and Venus.
I think that's what we should tell everybody. Do with that what you will. Yeah, I really, well, while you were, tracking them, like on the trail of them, felt like, uh, and then I love that one of them, threw you a curveball like they will when they're retrograde.
When does who do what?
Uh, but I was thinking about, I found that, that image came about unzip. the language. And then I did kind of go to Venus and the, unzipping, that the vulnerability of Venus retrograde, the opportunity to not be put together and to meet in a more intimate way, right? Like not where each one is tightly bound in, the shell or the clothing or the whatever. But that especially when we move from Aries back into Pisces, back into this much more kind of all over the place feeling, like your desires often in Pisces, like they can really, there's a lot of them, there's a lot of different things that open up in that. There's Aries, I think, has a sort of a directive orientation. Sometimes it's sort of like, here I go, we can look at the animal, we can watch those animals, those rams, right? They're going where they're going, and in fact, if that means collision, then that's, but they're going. They don't, there's no, and but if you watch, sea creatures, there, sure, some of them do, do that, but schools of fish, like, it's so amazing to watch them, and all of a sudden they go a completely different, and they all go all at once, they're the way things can change, that the creature with legs just simply cannot change orientation that fluidly, So watching Venus go back into that more fluid orientation, disorientation, and to do it with Mercury, of course, one of the things that summons is, Mercury and Venus are Hermes and Aphrodite, and therefore are hermaphrodite, right? And so that entire polyvocal, polygendered body, right? That really, I mean, it feels like, and I've been feeling it myself for the last, they've only been back together in Pisces for the last week, as you said. They both went back a couple, maybe 4 days ago, 5 days ago. And then they each met Neptune, right? They each kind
That's
of,
right.
really got even more, but I think I'm feeling it in our conversation, I mean, to speak honestly, I never say yes to conversations about the current astrological weather because I feel I'm not free the way that you and I are being free together to kind of just do it. And it's not a productivity seminar, like it's not like how to master your astrology, or it's put pressure on you and me that we have to really define it. So I feel like I could say yes to this because I'm like, yeah, we can be together. And that's what I feel like is going on with Venus and Mercury. I feel
Hmm.
like they're being together. They're like, and so dreaming really tends to speak right now. Um, you know, places that we haven't felt that we feel before, unauthorized desires, that usually we're not supposed to want it, we're supposed to do it, or, including those of us who've done a fuck ton of deconditioning. Like it really worked, and yet, conditioning remains. So that's kind of what I feel. I mean, I'm just really, even just right looking at your face while I'm saying it, I'm like, oh, this feels wet and alive, right?
I've been having just full body waves of chills actually while you're talking and actually feeling super emotional because
Mm,
some of what you're saying is helping me put into context some of what I've been feeling. Um, and you mentioned a while ago that aneretic degree of the whole ass zodiac, 29 Pisces, as being a moldy sponge. And and I have had very strong intense periods of depression as that 29th degree has been being aspected, especially with the North Node there.
mm,
And the last few days of Pisces season, oh man, I was so down. I was so down. And then when Mercury and Venus, just touched on it, I've been really struggling with my own energy,
mm,
feeling incredibly depleted physically, but really depleted kind of emotionally and spiritually
mm,
with the feeling of just frustration and this kind of endlessness of the impossibility of just being
mm,
and existing inside of all of the isms and capitalism being a big one and just feeling like
Yeah.
I know that we have more than enough. I know that we have what we need. I know that life is actually so creative and so brilliant, and that if we took care of life, life will take care of us.
Mm,
And this inversion, this mutation of the idea of debt,
mm,
and that so many of us are struggling to manage debt or to stay out of debt,
mm, mm,
but that our debts, I feel that debt is deeply a sacred contract that is meant to uphold right relationship and reciprocity, and that when there's harm or something is taken, that it is spiritually necessary for us to be in repayment. But the kind of debt that we're existing in late stage capitalism is not that. It's
no.
totally a mutation of that.
Yeah.
And it really imprisons consciousness and
Yes.
then life. And it is just so fucking depressing, to see what human beings are doing to each other and to the earth,
Mm,
and to know that we're capable of so much more.
mm,
And so when you named, oh, Hermes and Aphrodite together are hermaphrodite.
mm,
And in my mind, immediately went to, that's the argument right now. The way that binary systems of thinking are being used to literally weaponize human beings and everything.
yes.
This kind of ongoing argument around gender, and fascists talking about dangerous gender ideology, while meanwhile life on Earth has always been
Yeah.
gender expansive, and there's
Exactly.
intersex people have existed forever. Gender is a total concept made up by human
Right.
beings,
Right.
and that there, you're talking about I don't know, I don't remember when now, probably talking about Saturn, or maybe we were thinking about different ways of being with astrology, but this this arrogance of the human mind to think that we can plan things and we know how it works.
Mm,
Like, I know how it works. There's only two genders. There's only one God and there's only two genders. But
right.
meanwhile, I'm not even paying attention to the place where I am,
Mm,
which is full of so much happening inside of spectrums, and so much that I can't even see and I don't even
and
know is here.
and so muchness is Pisces, right? Right? Like
Yes.
the acknowledgement of so muchness,
Yes.
and then also beginning to experience that as abundance rather than as things that threaten my how I have it set up, and I think that's the thing I'm really it's if I could share, like for me, when I think about our current moment and the sociopathic and dark demonic forces that are present right now, and that are so interesting, because not interesting, but interesting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, from an archetypal mythic
Well,
standpoint, it's fascinating.
I hesitated to say it because there's I really do feel that he who, and I don't mean to invoke something, but it's like he who looks at evil is looked back at by you have to be careful what you're fascinated by.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was gonna say is that the Uranus and Gemini, Pluto and Aquarius, the dismantling is asked for. I
Mm-hmm.
feel there's a dismantling urge. And yet what occurs when we're in those times of dismantle, where if it's chaotic, it does give entry points for authoritarian and fascist and other, like, to really and to say that they are the ones, they think they're tearing it down. There's a very strong takedown that is underway, but it is so it can be, it's dismembering. That's the language
Yes.
that I keep coming to for myself, is that dismantling is needed, but dismembering is how it's being done. There's a
Mm.
dismembering, like a cutting, a self-destruction impulse that is really a field right now. Like, as a group, group work is my favorite thing. And so in groups, we would call the anti-group, in the thing that could take the whole thing down when it is allowed to run things. And we see now the anti-group is now established as the one running the show. That is dismembering, that has a tearing apart. And so for me, that's really the resourcing that we've been talking about is so crucial, because in the face of that level of activation, I think a lot about people I worked with. I used to work almost entirely with dissociative process, like, including dissociative identity process where there's multiple parts of self. By the way, I would not call it a disorder. I would call it a really adaptive response to encounters with sociopathy, right? To encounters with interpersonal violence and being targeted, like we are
Mm,
a huge
mm,
uptick in now. And so dissociative process happens and we fragment. And the first thing to go is symbolic and creative thinking, like because we go to survival consciousness necessarily, right? We get very literal and very concrete. Will I be safe? Will I be okay? Will my people I love be okay? Will the land I love be okay? And so it's really can be a real challenge to move into symbolic, like our conversation has been in, right? We've created a safe space for these hours. We will go back to survival concerns to some extent, but not facing what many people are. But you know, but these moments, these little Pisces bubbles, feel really important to develop a fluency with as we move into. Again, there's a dismantling that is happening. It didn't have to be dismemberment, but that's what people
mm,
are choosing. Um, but for me, there's something about maintaining the symbolizing consciousness. uh, it's almost the most important thing for me is like, how do we, really tend and create spaces and places which induce that consciousness? Because we most need it now. We most need open-ended, creative, imaginative ways of being and imagining. But it's very hard to do that when threat, and intentional, willful infliction of trauma on people, like in a more remarkable way than in quite a while. In terms of just the again, that's the sociopathy element that I feel that is really does cause fragmentation and splitting. That's and shock and like immobilization and automatic obedience and compliance, right? You watch the universities, uh, begin to go obey. And anyhow, I don't mean to go on about it, but it feels to me, I love that you and I today here and those in our field with us uh, are are really asking about what that Pisces time might be for the even just this Venus Mercury, and then to think about what these various retrogrades back to Pisces to memory in part, right? To remember what is being dismembered. There's so much dismemberment, and it's like, how do we remember in our own consciousness with each other? There's
mm,
a and create the space for memory as things do accelerate, right? It's um I don't know the answer to that, but I feel that's a question I really care about a lot, is how do we create these spaces together, keep creating them. And you do this is your work, I know, and many of us, and but I do think it's more than ever we're that
mm.
I'm not sure how the words are working here, but I think you can feel me.
I definitely do. And I feel also a return, a remembering of, this earlier question around why is there a wave of experiential embodied astrology right now?
Yes, yes.
And, a lot of the work that we've done at EA over the last 2+ years has been, I'm particularly thinking of my colleagues, Ramon Parrish and Janata Petrus and Sherry Taylor. Working with Afrofuturism and kind of ideas around retrocausality. I'm thinking about Sankofa as a symbol that in order to move forward, we have to also be able to move and
Mm,
connect with the past.
absolutely. Yeah.
And that within I think many lineages of spiritual tradition and cosmology, and then definitely as a kind of central point of Afrofuturism, that there's this idea that multiple timelines are happening and that we can receive messages from the future right now that can help us navigate the present, and also that we can revisit the past in order to, in some ways, not literally change the past, but energetically and metaphorically and imaginatively understand it differently so that we can be in place and space
Mm,
more informed,
mhm,
and then potentially then to change the future.
mhm,
Um, and and so with what you're saying, I'm thinking about queer people,
Yeah.
queerness
Yeah.
and this kind of innate magical beingness that I feel like has to exist inside of queer resistance and queer community.
Mhm.
That for so long, you know, that is the way that we survive, is that we remember ancestors that have been erased.
Yeah.
We know that we've always exist. We know that we exist in the future, and we know that what we bring to the present, to the future, and to the past is life force. It is
Mhm.
creative force. It is like you're
Mhm.
saying, as soon as you have three, then
Mhm.
you have creativity,
Yeah.
and that secret third thing is actually that's the secret of life,
Yeah.
the creative intelligence of
Which
life.
is why we should, really question all binaries. I mean,
Exactly. I
like,
mean, binaries, it's like, yes, we have night and day as a kind of,
mm,
it's like, okay, yeah, there's a predominance in bodies of people who have genitals that look one way and then look another way. But then when
mm,
you look really closely, everybody's on a spectrum. There's like all kinds of all the things look kind of different, in between night and day, you've got a whole
Twilight.
spectrum of twilight and shades of depth and intensity. Um,
I like that.
and I really feel that, that there's something that I can feel in the resistance movements right now. And whether that's like with queer community, whether that's, for me, learning more and starting to connect more with Palestinian people and the struggle that has been happening there and
Mhm.
how that connects, to the carceral state here and like ongoing anti-Blackness and um, I mean, they're all intertwined,
Yeah.
but that there is this really strong feeling that I have that we are a very unique generation,
Mm,
because of how much remembering has been able to happen. And I think in large part because of
mm,
the internet, and I'm curious about what Pluto and Aquarius does for
mm,
us over the next 20 years, but that we're a generation that has had our imagination seeded and expanded.
mm,
And there's been all kinds of destructive things we could talk about with the internet, but I do feel like a lot of us have access to knowing
mm,
that it's always been here
mhm.
and that it proliferates and that it's everywhere in ways that maybe previous generations felt more alone or felt more isolated inside of their struggles. And
Mm.
that even with the efforts of fascists to make us feel like we're totally alone and to give us those experiences, we've already had these other experiences. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they're already in the field.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, I'm going to say that and then be like, okay, I know I'm looking at time. I know we only have a short amount
Oh,
of time
yeah,
left.
right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we can let this be the transition to talking about the last retrograde, which we are still kind of in the shadow of, which is Mars. And Mars is the traditional ruler of Aries.
Yeah.
And so all these kind of movements in Aries have also been referencing back to Mars.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and Mars is the least frequently retrograding and longest lasting retrograde of the inner planets.
Mm.
Mars station retrograde at 6 degrees of Leo, December 6, 2024. It's stationed direct at 17 degrees of Cancer, February 24th of 2025.
Mm.
And currently, right now, Mars is still in Cancer and it's trine with Saturn and sextile with Neptune as they start to form their aspect. And it feels to me that, that martial energy is so important in the conversation that we're having because of the ways that it represents both the individuation of Aries and the regenerative, reproductive, kind of attractive element of Scorpio and the desire there. And the fight, the fight.
Yeah.
um, and Jason, I know that you have also been spending a lot of time with Mars and teaching about Mars. Recently,
Yeah.
I think this is your focus for the Living Astrologies Conference is to be
Yeah,
with
that
Mars.
mine will be a bit Mars. It's true.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So how, in these last 10 minutes or so that we have, I wonder if you might guide us a little bit into feeling into how does Mars play into this and how might we work with Mars in this moment?
Yeah, yeah, I want to do that in relation to what you did just a minute ago, speaking, where I really was hearing, like when you were referring to Afrofuturism and the simultaneity of multiple timelines and the capacity to access past and future. Anyhow, what I was feeling was that you were really showing us, with these various retrogrades from fire to water, which also Mars, that's how Mars is in Cancer now, is having retrograded back. What and then you use this language of life force, and I really think that's maybe one way to play with these energies and participate is to really feel how when they go back to water, they do move into a really a very it's very pretty easy to time travel in water in that way. Like again, all the water holds memory, water holds memory. Fire is not about memory, right? But water is, and memory of the future also, like that fluid, that thing you just described, multiple scapes. And and then, yes, at some point you begin to realize the present is where the life force is. And that's the fire. To me, that's the cusp. That's the movement into fire. So I felt like you were modeling in what you shared, what maybe a way to play with to do this is, because it is really taking advantage of the time, all the capacity to play with time in that Pisces and Cancerian way to come to the Mars. Like this has been a very tender time from what I have seen, the Mars and Cancer time. I have always felt the creature is very tender there, which is in no way stops it from being powerful and active and all the things Mars is. But it's a very tenderized consciousness, Cancer. It's quite personal, and so I think it's been a really, and it can be a really, like, again, in the same way that we're going to collective memory and stuff in Pisces and bigger, in the Cancerian inflection, there's been a huge invitation to feel one's own tenderness, which might mean feeling the so-called harder emotions like sadness and grief and frustrated anger and various things. But I don't think tenderness is always about always has a valence, but it is just an incredible vulnerability. And Mars, it's nice of you to, it makes me a little weepy. Yeah, which is nice. Well, I like that. Maybe I'm showing Mars and Cancer's beauty right now, because to me, it's a beautiful thing. Mars to me, is so vulnerable. The vulnerability of Mars is to me just it's so remarkable because Mars does take a risk. It does step in. It does say, I want, I desire, I'm going for it. And there's so much vulnerability in that, whatever the sign the Mars is in. Like there's so much vulnerability. I went to a part of why I decided to do this Mars thing at the conference is I was in Greece last year with a group taking people to sacred sites connected to our companions. And so Mars, we didn't go to a Mars place, and I felt like, oh, I need to go to one after. And I went, it's a long story, but it was off the beaten path. I had to like ditch the car and walk for, I don't know, an hour and a half in the beating sun. And I was red faced by the
You
time
really found Mars.
I did. I mean, I arrived sweating and, it was hilarious. And it was the most peaceful place that I had ever visited. Like it was truly, I mean, nobody goes there. It's off the beaten path. It's called it's so so I had that encounter with Mars in that way and really felt the vulnerability of the warrior, right? I think sometimes for those of us who are so fatigued by the turn towards violence and war that the archetype of the soldier or the warrior is often like ugh, like this overarmed thing, trying to be powerful and all the masculinist bullshit around it. But actually when you kind of hang out with it for a minute, you realize the vulnerability of that person, or and it's like um so there's a tenderness and a vulnerability that I think is really natural to the moment. Um and if we again, I love what you and I've been playing with together, where when they move back to the water, there is a remembering and a resourcing possible. And of course it always does have that feeling of like I could be overwhelmed by this, that is, and in fact you can be. It's actually true, right? I mean, people can be completely immobilized and overwhelmed and unable to find to find anything other than what's got them. The sea
Mhm.
monster doesn't let you go till it lets you go. Like you're not able to struggle out of it. However, like I do think whatever you get while he's back there, it's again, it might be that memory thing that then when you come into Leo again, as he will, I don't remember when, but I think you told us that, when he will step in there, or they or whatever. I mean, I say he with Mars right now. I haven't always. I mean, they definitely move. So when Mars moves into Leo, I think there's a really a way again, like you said that the phrase life force is very fire to me. I mean, it's everywhere, but the fire seems the most like, and I think all that tenderness can come along with the Leo sharing, because Leo also has a remarkable level of vulnerability. I mean, these are the two signs ruled by the luminaries,
Mm.
who are so vulnerable. Like they're so seen, like like yeah, I mean, actually, oddly enough, the sun, you actually did a great thing about the sun because doesn't quite get seen, right? We don't look right at it. It doesn't, so the sun versus having a name, and that was a great piece. But still, they're out there, right? In the moon, you watch the moon go through all of their phases and all of like they're undressed and now they're and they have to go through all that right in front of us. So Cancer and Leo, they have a
Mm.
so that would be my invitation with Mars is that tenderness and um, the risk take the really acknowledging one's own vulnerability. I've found Martian folk, meaning people who have a strong Mars or they're under strong Mars process, love it when you acknowledge how vulnerable they are. Like they really are waiting for somebody to acknowledge, like, this is actually hard what I'm doing. It might look like
Yeah.
I'm doing it. It might look like I'm, but actually, fuck, do I have to?
Yeah. Um, can
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
you
yeah,
have to
yeah.
go. Oh, so what was coming up for me listening to you was a memory, it's such a funny memory. So I've trained in a lot of different somatic methodologies, and I was with a teacher, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who does some work called body mind centering, and we were studying the development of the gonads and the sex organs.
Mm,
And it's a really interesting development. They begin with the brain. They're part of the actual pathway of the kidneys, the mesonephrin development.
mm.
And a lot of people know that up until, a certain point, both sexes are the same.
Yeah, yeah.
And then they start to differentiate, and there is actually a wide intersex spectrum. But so we did this embodiment practice where we really tried to visualize and embody the pathway of the development of these different, um, organisms.
Mm.
And for me, as a person who has spent my whole life with a uterus and ovaries and have never had a penis and testicles, when we did that embodiment, I felt so vulnerable. And I was like,
Why?
oh my God, the having externalized
Yeah.
genitalia is a whole thing. Like, here I've gone my whole life thinking that, this experience is, creating this kind of imposing,
Mm,
externalizing force, da da da. But
mm.
actually, there's a lot to be protected there, and there's a deep sensitivity
Yeah,
that, for those of us with more internal reproductive organs, we just have a different experience of.
totally.
So that emerged for me as a memory. I just thought I'd share that. But this particular Mars retrograde is a really personal one for me because Mars stationed retrograde on my ascendant at 6
Um,
Leo. And
wow.
then my natal Mars is at 22 Cancer. So Mars
Mm.
stationed direct very close to my natal
Yeah,
degree.
that's amazing. Mm,
Yeah, and it's gone back into my 12th house and then over my ascendant. So this whole kind of comparison to the last degrees of the zodiac and Pisces Aries can also be kind of extrapolated to the 12th and the first
mm,
houses. And with what you were saying, one of the big things that's been coming forward for me has just been I need to be able to exist and to be real about it and to not to not hide who I am, including my motivations and my sensitivities and vulnerability and humanness.
Mm.
And that in a lot of ways, I, like many people, have hidden those things because I think other people don't want them. They're not quote unquote good enough. They're not developed enough. It's selfish to be like that or,
Oh, yeah. Right.
whatever. And what has been coming through for me just really strongly is that that's actually the only way that I'm going to be able to be empowered in my life is
Yes. I
is to
hear.
really include myself. And I think that that's a big lesson for Leo, as a kind of centralizing principle,
Mhm.
is that we can dream our biggest dreams for the world, but if we don't include ourselves in those dreams,
Yeah.
then the dreams themselves can become very destructive
Hmm.
for ourselves and for others. And I really feel like, yeah, at the end of our conversation, kind of this sense of, if I was going to predict, or offer some kind of suggestion and advice to all of us right now, that there is something really important, I think, about the releasing of the ideas of who we are,
Mm.
whether that's nationality or gender or political orientation or, class or age or whatever. And and embracing the dismemberment as an opportunity to be remembered, to really
Mm.
experience that word of the coming back together of the members, that we are made up of a microbiome and a biological ecosystem that is encompassing of everything that we are inside of and a part of.
Mm.
And that that's actually going to be the place where we find true power, and that anything that's trying to, control that is
Mm.
very confused, a confused manifestation that it won't lead to power for anybody. It might lead
Yeah.
to force or destruction, but it's not the same thing as power.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, as you spoke that, I was thinking of I've always thought with Leo, there's a thing about respect and self-respect, and what you were just counseling of about be careful what you say as being, what you say you want respected, like really take it. I've always loved that word, to look again, respect, and there's a look again, like, okay, and as you said, like beingness, like beyond whatever the categorizations and the decisions about who I am and so on, there is a fundamental that I think Leo energy is looking for, which is to be met with respect, and we have to do it with ourselves first. I don't know about first, but alongside, we really have to that look again, like, oh, and get that wonderful validation feeling, because it's a good feeling.
Mm,
And it's a good feeling when it comes from others also. Like, it's a good feeling. And
mm.
and Leo, I always say, I feel everyone does, but often with a Leo, I have to sort of say, yeah, you deserve this. This is good for you.
Yeah, we have to
Uh,
be available.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate that quite a bit. I too am noticing the time and kind of reluctant to go.
Yeah, yeah, me too. But more to come, Jason. Thank you so much for being here today. And for anyone listening who's interested in Jason's work or the Living Astrologies Conference, the information will be included in the show notes. And
Yeah,
you can
please come and
find,
join us. We didn't say as much as we thought we were going to about that, but it's going to be really, there's an emergent field in this. And if you come to this conference, you are known as a co-creator. And frankly, even if you don't, but truly, this is a mode of coming together that I think is everything we've been sharing is what we intend for that time. And it's yeah, there's a lot of creatures and beings and gods and goddesses and everybody gathering. So yeah, anyway, I'm glad we got to say something about it.
me too, me too. Jason, thank you so much.
Thank you.